The 7th of November 2013, Tacloban City, Philippines. The evening light came in low and orange across Leyte Gulf, the way it always did in early November, flat and warm, turning the surface of the water to hammered copper. Children were still out in the streets near the waterfront. Vendors packed up their stalls along the market road. Jeepneys moved through the intersection at their usual unhurried pace, painted in reds and yellows, trailing diesel smoke. In the barangays along the coast, families sat on plastic chairs outside their homes and watched the sky do what the sky in the Philippines does in November, darken slowly, with drama, then release. Tacloban was a city of roughly 240,000 people, the regional capital of Eastern Visayas, set at the narrow head of San Pedro Bay, where the geography of the land acts as a natural funnel. The bay curves inward at Tacloban like the inside of a cupped hand deep water, narrowing rapidly toward a low, flat coastline that sits barely 5 meters above sea level. It was a beautiful location. It had always been a beautiful location. And it had always been, for anyone who understood how water moves through constrained geography under the influence of extreme pressure, a profoundly dangerous one. The Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical and Astronomical Services Administration, PAGASA, had been tracking the storm for days. As early as November 6th, 2 days before landfall, PAGASA issued warnings placing Tacloban and the eastern Visayas directly in the path of what was by then classified as a super typhoon. The warnings used Signal Number 4, the highest level in the Philippine storm warning system. Government officials ordered evacuations. President Benigno Aquino held press conferences. The military pre-positioned relief goods. By some estimates, around 800,000 people were moved to designated evacuation centers in the hours before the storm arrived. The system, on paper, was working, but buried inside the official warnings inside the technical language that PAGASA broadcast over radio and television to a population that had survived typhoons every year of their lives was a phrase that would later become the subject of investigation, academic study, and bitter recrimination. Storm surge. PAGASA warned of a storm surge reaching 5 to 6 meters along the eastern Visayas coastline. They used the term correctly. They used it repeatedly. What they could not control, what no agency had yet built the infrastructure to address, was whether the people receiving that warning understood what it meant. The Philippines experiences roughly 20 tropical cyclones per year. 10 of them reach typhoon strength. 5 cause major damage. For generations, the people of Tacloban and Leyte had built a practical, embodied knowledge of what a typhoon does. It brings wind, it brings rain, it floods the low streets, it tears off iron roofs and breaks windows and bends the coconut palms horizontal. You take your family to a sturdy building, a school, a church, a government evacuation center, and you wait it out. When the wind stops, you come out and begin the work of cleaning up. This knowledge was accurate. It had kept people alive through dozens of storms. It had never been tested against a storm surge. A storm surge is not a flood. It is not rain accumulating in low ground. It is the ocean itself displaced by the atmospheric vacuum at the center of an extreme low-pressure system, pushed ahead of the storm like water in front of a piston, arriving not gradually but as a single coherent mass of seawater moving inland at speed. It looks, to those who have never seen one, like the sea simply rising. Witnesses who survived the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami described a similar sensation, the water not breaking over the shore but advancing through it, through streets and buildings and everything in between, at the height of a second floor, a third floor, carrying with it every object in its path. Most people in Tacloban had never seen a storm surge. Most people in Tacloban had never needed to. And so, on the evening of the 7th of November 2013, the evacuations proceeded, but they proceeded according to the mental model that generations of typhoon experience had constructed. People moved to higher floors of concrete buildings near the water, certain that concrete would hold. People moved to schools designated as official evacuation centers, trusting the government maps that had placed those centers just outside the projected danger zone. People moved their valuables upstairs. They filled jugs with water. They brought extra food. They told their children it would be a bad storm, but that they had been through bad storms before. The government hazard maps, the documents that emergency planners had used to designate which buildings were safe, which zones were dangerous, where evacuation centers should be placed, had been drawn based on the historical record of storm surges in the Philippines. The worst storm surge in that record reached approximately 3 to 4 meters. The maps reflected that history. They projected a worst-case scenario of 5 to 6 meters. What was moving toward Tacloban across the warm waters of the Pacific was not a historical event. It was something outside the record entirely. On the evening of November 7th, in the waters east of the Philippines, Super Typhoon Haiyan carried sustained winds of 315 kilometers per hour. Its central pressure sat at 895 hectopascals. It was 600 kilometers wide, and it was accelerating toward a coastline where the geometry of the land, the narrowing funnel of San Pedro Bay pressing inward toward Tacloban, would concentrate every cubic meter of water the storm pushed ahead of it into a single, focused point. The evacuation centers were ready. The relief goods were pre-positioned. The warnings had been broadcast, but what was coming was not a typhoon. It was something the Philippines had never seen, and the maps, the buildings, and the words used to warn people about it had all been drawn from a world that no longer applied. There is a particular cruelty in a system that warns people accurately and saves them anyway from the wrong thing. The Philippine disaster preparedness infrastructure in 2013 was not negligent. It was not indifferent. The officials who issued the warnings, the local government units that ordered evacuations, the emergency managers who opened the shelters, they acted. They acted days in advance. They used the highest alert level available to them. And when Haiyan made landfall on the morning of November 8th, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people had already moved from their homes to somewhere they believed was safer. The system failed not because it was ignored. It failed because the catastrophe it was designed to prevent was not the catastrophe that arrived. The storm surge hazard maps that Philippine emergency planners used in 2013 had been built from the only data available to them, the historical record of storm surges that had struck the Philippines in the preceding decades. That record was extensive. The Philippines had endured more typhoons than almost any nation on Earth. But the historical record of storm surges in the Philippines had a ceiling. No storm that had previously struck these islands had produced a surge beyond 3 to 4 meters in the areas around Tacloban. The government maps reflected that ceiling. The worst-case projection for Haiyan's surge was 5 to 6 meters, already unprecedented by local standards, already far beyond anything the living population had experienced. The actual surge, when it arrived, reached 7.5 meters in places, more than 20 feet of open ocean, moving inland. The evacuation centers placed just outside the projected 5 to 6 meter danger zones were not outside the actual danger zone. They were inside it. People who had followed every official instruction, who had done precisely what the government told them to do, found themselves in buildings that the storm surge reached, entered, and filled. Post-disaster investigations revealed the full geometry of the failure. Researchers examining the placement of evacuation centers in Tacloban found that nearly all of them sat within the actual surge inundation area outside the government-projected zone. Yes, but inside the zone the water actually reached. The maps had been accurate to their data. The data had been inadequate to the storm, but the maps were only one layer of the failure. The second layer was the word itself. Studies conducted after the disaster, including peer-reviewed research published in disaster risk journals, found that a significant portion of the population in the eastern Visayas did not understand what the term storm surge described. Pagasa had used the term correctly and consistently, but the concept it named a wall of seawater driven inland by atmospheric pressure, behaving nothing like rain or flooding, arriving not as a rising water table but as a moving body of ocean, had no deep referent in the lived experience of most coastal Filipinos. Typhoon wind they understood in their bodies, in the memory of every storm they had endured. Storm surge was a technical term for a phenomenon outside their experience. The Secretary of the Department of Social Welfare and Development said it plainly in the aftermath. People were preparing for wind and rain. They understood wind and rain. What was coming was not, in any functional sense, wind and rain. There was a third layer, older than the maps, older than the warning system, older than any government agency. Before 2013, the mangroves that had lined the coastline around Tacloban and across much of the eastern Visayas had been systematically cleared, not through negligence, through development. Aquaculture, fish ponds, and shrimp farms had replaced the dense, tangled barrier of mangrove forest that had grown along this coastline for centuries. Mangroves are not merely trees, their root systems dense, interlocking, extending both above and below the waterline, dissipate wave energy, slow surge velocity, and reduce inundation depth. Studies conducted on coastlines struck by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami found that areas with intact mangrove cover experienced measurably lower inundation depths than adjacent cleared coastlines. By 2013, those natural barriers along the Tacloban coastline were largely gone. The fish ponds they had been replaced with offered no resistance whatsoever to a 7-meter wall of moving water. The water moved through them without slowing, and in the pre-dawn hours of the 8th of November 2013, every one of these failures, the underestimated maps, the misunderstood warning, the cleared coastline converged on a city of 240,000 people who had done what they were told and moved to the places they had been told were safe. Across Tacloban, in the hours before dawn, the wind was already extraordinary. The outer bands of Haiyan had been battering the city since midnight. Iron roofing sheets torn from houses skimmed horizontally through the darkness like blades. The rain fell not in drops, but in continuous horizontal sheets, driven by winds already exceeding 100 kilometers per hour and climbing. In the evacuation centers, schools, churches, government buildings, people pressed together in hallways and classrooms, listening to the structure around them flex and groan, telling each other that the worst would pass. In the evacuation center at the Tacloban Astrodome, thousands had gathered. In schools along the waterfront, hundreds more. In concrete houses near the shore, families had moved their children to upper floors, confident that the walls would hold. The water, when it came, would not distinguish between those who had evacuated and those who had stayed. It would not distinguish between concrete and wood, between designated shelters and private homes, between people who had heard the warning and people who had not. It would reach the height it was always going to reach, determined not by any human decision, but by the speed of the wind, the pressure at the eye, the temperature of the water, and the geometry of a bay that narrowed like a funnel directly into the heart of the city. They had done everything they were told to do, and it would not be enough. At 4:40 inches the morning on the 8th of November 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan made its first landfall at Guayuan, on the eastern tip of Samar Island. There was no one left in Guayuan to watch it arrive. The town had been evacuated. The streets were empty. The fishing boats had been pulled as far inland as their owners could drag them. And still, in the darkness, the storm came ashore with winds that the Joint Typhoon Warning Center had clocked at 170 knots at landfall, 195 miles per hour, sustained. Not gusts, sustained, the kind of wind speed that removes the category of wind from ordinary human experience entirely and enters the territory of something closer to physics, to the behavior of gas under extreme pressure differentials, to forces that do not bend structures so much as they reclassify them as temporary. Guayuan was not destroyed gradually. It was processed. The wind arrived from the east as a single continuous roar that survivors in reinforced structures described as unlike any sound they had encountered, not the shrieking, variable howl of ordinary typhoon winds, but a deep, unrelenting pressure, more felt in the chest and the inner ear than heard, as if the atmosphere itself had become a solid object moving at speed. Concrete block walls cracked along their mortar lines and came apart. Roofs lifted as single units and were gone. Trees that had survived 30 years of typhoons snapped at the base or were uprooted entirely, root balls and all, and deposited in fields and roads and what remained of buildings. Haiyan crossed Samar in less than an hour. By 5 a.m. it had entered Leyte Gulf, the body of water that separates Samar from Leyte Island, that narrows at its northern end into San Pedro Bay, that terminates at the flat, low coastline of Tacloban City. The storm surge had already begun. In the open ocean ahead of a moving super typhoon, the low atmospheric pressure at the eye acts on the surface of the water like a hand pressing from above being suddenly removed. The water rises toward the vacuum, mounding upward at the center of the storm, pushed outward and forward by the rotational winds. By the time this mound of displaced ocean entered the narrowing geometry of Leyte Gulf, it had been building for hours over hundreds of kilometers of open Pacific water. The Gulf's coastlines pressed inward. The water, with nowhere else to go, rose. In Tacloban, the first sign was not a wave. It was the sea disappearing. Witnesses who survived on upper floors of buildings near the waterfront reported that in the minutes before the surge arrived, the water in the bay receded, dramatically pulled back, drawn outward, exposing mudflats and the hulls of beached fishing boats that had never been visible before. It lasted only moments. Then the horizon changed. What came was described, by every survivor account gathered afterward, not as a wave but as a wall, a vertical face of dark water, moving at the speed of a running person, then faster, then the speed of a vehicle. And it was not breaking or cresting, it was simply advancing, the entire depth of it moving as a single body, carrying on its surface everything it had already consumed. Fishing boats, vehicles, the debris of whatever had already been destroyed along the coastline to the east, and beneath it, invisible until the water arrived, the weight of the Pacific Ocean pressing through a funnel 30 kilometers wide into a city built on flat ground 5 meters above sea level. The surge reached Tacloban at approximately 6 a.m., just as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to show above the mountains to the east. Most of the city was still in darkness. In the evacuation centers near the waterfront, people on ground floors had no warning and no time. The water entered through windows and doors simultaneously, rising at a rate that witnesses on upper floors described as a foot per second, faster than a person could climb stairs if the stairs were already crowded with hundreds of other people trying to climb them at the same time. People who had been sitting on floors were suddenly standing. People who had been standing were suddenly treading water. And the water was not still. It was moving fast, turbulent, carrying debris that struck people and pinned them against walls and ceilings. The Tacloban airport, a long, low building set close to the water, was struck by a surge that investigators later measured at 6 meters at that location. The terminal building flooded to its roof. Aircraft on the tarmac were moved. The control tower, a reinforced concrete structure, survived. Everything around it did not. A survivor in Tacloban, whose account was recorded by the Stockholm Environment Institute a decade after the storm, described the morning this way. She had been in her concrete house near the shore with her family when the water came. She said the house held, the walls did not fall, but the water inside reached the ceiling of the ground floor before it stopped rising, and her family spent the duration of the storm on the second floor listening to the sound of their possessions, their furniture, the objects of their entire life, being moved and broken and taken away by water they could not see in the darkness below them. She said when the water finally receded and they came downstairs, the ground floor had been cleaned. That was the word she used. Cleaned. Everything was gone. In the neighborhoods closer to the bay, the structures were not concrete. They were the dense, layered communities of mixed wood and iron and concrete block that make up the residential fabric of a Philippine coastal city built incrementally, repaired after every typhoon, embedded with the lives of families across multiple generations. These neighborhoods did not survive the surge. The water moved through them and they came apart, and the debris of them, every plank and beam and sheet of iron roofing, became part of the surge itself, part of the mass of material the water carried inland until the energy dissipated, until the water slowed and stopped and began the long process of draining back. The surge reached 2 kilometers inland from the coastline. 90% of the structures in Tacloban were damaged or destroyed. By 7 a.m., less than an hour after the surge arrived, Haiyan had already crossed Leyte and was moving into the Camotes Sea toward the next island. The storm that had taken 4 hours to cross the Philippine archipelago from east to west left behind it a corridor of destruction, 600 kilometers wide. Haiyan continued westward through the South China Sea, making additional landfalls in Vietnam, before finally dissipating over southern China on November 11th. But on the morning of November 8th, as the wind dropped over Tacloban and the water receded from the streets and the first pale light of a clear post-storm sky appeared above the mountains, the city that remained was not the city that had existed the night before. The telephone lines were down. Every one of them. The airport was flooded. The roads out of the city were blocked by debris. The bridges that connected Leyte to the outside world were damaged or impassable. The electricity grid had failed completely. The hospitals, the buildings designated to receive the injured, were themselves damaged, their ground floors inundated, their supplies compromised, their staff, in many cases, among the missing. Tacloban, in the hours after Haiyan, was not a disaster zone in the administrative sense, a place where emergency systems had been activated and resources were flowing and the apparatus of response was in motion. It was a place that had been severed, cut off from communication, from supply, from any mechanism by which the outside world could reach it, or it could reach the outside world. The storm had passed, but for the survivors standing in the wreckage of a city that the water had cleaned down to its bones with no food, no clean water, no electricity, no way to call for help, and the bodies of their neighbors lying in the debris around them. The worst was not over. It had not even been named yet. The silence came first. Not the silence of peace, the silence of subtraction. The silence of a city whose every ambient sound, every generator and jeepney engine and market stall radio and child's voice in a schoolyard had been removed simultaneously and replaced with nothing, with the soft sound of water still moving through streets, with the occasional crack of a structure that had been compromised by the surge finally giving way hours after the water had passed, with the wind diminished now to something almost ordinary, moving through the skeletal remains of trees that had been stripped of every leaf and stood naked and gray against a sky that had turned, with grotesque indifference, a perfect cloudless blue. The 8th of November 2013, mid-morning, Tacloban City. 90% of the structures in the city had been damaged or destroyed. The coastal barangays, the dense residential neighborhoods that had lined the waterfront, that had housed the fishing families and market workers and tricycle drivers who made up the daily fabric of the city, were gone in the most literal sense. Not damaged, gone. The surge had moved through them and taken them apart and distributed their components across the inland areas of the city so that streets 2 kilometers from the water were buried under meters of debris that had, the previous morning, been someone's home. The bodies were everywhere. This is the sentence that every journalist, every aid worker, every government official who arrived in Tacloban in the days after the storm wrote and spoke and could not find an adequate way to frame. The bodies were in the debris. They were in the remaining trees. They were on the roadsides where the receding surge had deposited them. The official death toll, 6,300 confirmed dead, 1,062 missing, was compiled over weeks and months from records that were themselves incomplete. In a city where the civil registry had been destroyed, where entire families had been killed together and there was no one left to report them missing. Investigators who studied the mortality patterns found that the deaths were concentrated with terrible specificity in the lowest-lying coastal areas and in the evacuation centers, that the surge had reached the places where people had gathered because they had been told those places were safe. The airport reopened to military flights 3 days after the storm. 3 days. For 72 hours, Tacloban existed in a condition of almost complete isolation from the outside world. The telecommunications infrastructure, every cell tower, every landline exchange, every radio relay station in the eastern Visayas had been destroyed or rendered inoperable by the storm. In the immediate aftermath, there was no way for survivors inside the city to communicate with anyone outside it. No way to report what had happened. No way to call for specific resources, no way to tell the outside world how many people were injured, where they were concentrated, what they needed most urgently, and no way for the outside world to coordinate a response to a situation it could only partially see from satellite imagery and the fragmentary accounts of people who had managed to leave the city by whatever means they could find. In the absence of communication, the absence of food, the absence of any visible government presence in the streets, the social order that had held through the storm began to fracture in the hours and days that followed. Survivors broke into stores and warehouses not for valuables, but for rice, for water, for infant formula, for the most elementary materials of staying alive. The government, when it characterized these actions publicly, used the word looting. The survivors, when they described them later, used the word survival. The distinction mattered less than the fact that it was happening at all, that a city of 240,000 people had been left for 3 days, without food distribution, without functioning medical care, without any organized system for meeting the most basic needs of the living, while the dead lay unburied in the streets around them. International aid arrived eventually. Massively. Eventually. 33 countries pledged support. The United States sent the aircraft carrier USS George Washington and a naval task force. The United Nations mobilized one of the largest humanitarian responses in its history. More than $1.5 billion in foreign aid was pledged in the weeks after the storm. The scale of the international response was, by any measure, extraordinary. But in the first 72 hours, in the hours when the injured were dying from untreated wounds, when dehydration was beginning to kill the elderly and the very young, when the psychological shock of total destruction was settling over an entire urban population with nowhere to go and nothing to return to, the machinery of that extraordinary response was still assembling itself on runways and in warehouses thousands of miles away. A survivor whose account was recorded by international researchers a decade after the storm said that for the first 2 days after Haiyan, She did not know if the rest of the world knew they were there. She said the silence was the most frightening thing, not the storm, which had been loud beyond description, but the silence after it, when the phones did not work and no planes came and the city sat in the wreckage of itself under a clear sky with no way to know if anyone was coming. The investigation that followed, conducted by Philippine government agencies, international disaster researchers, and independent scientists, identified the failures with a precision that the chaos of the disaster had obscured. The storm surge hazard maps were revised. The government commissioned new modeling that accounted for the geometry of San Pedro Bay and the amplifying effect of the narrow funnel on surge height. The revised maps showed inundation depths far exceeding anything the pre-Haiyan models had projected, depths that, had they existed before November 8th, would have placed every one of the flooded evacuation centers inside the danger zone. New evacuation protocols were written requiring people to move not just to designated centers, but to higher ground, genuinely higher ground, measured in elevation above sea level, rather than distance from the projected inundation boundary. A new storm surge warning system was developed, one that used not technical terminology but physical description. Not storm surge. Instead, the warnings would describe the water height in human terms as tall as a 2-story building, as tall as a 3-story building, so that the warning would produce in the listener not a bureaucratic categorization but a physical image. A no-build zone was established along the Tacloban coastline. Families who had lived in the waterfront barangays for generations were relocated, not without resistance, not without grief, not without the complex politics of displacement that follow every attempt to move people from the land their lives were built on. The mangroves that had been cleared for fish ponds along the eastern Visayas coastline began to be replanted, slowly, through programs run by local government and international NGOs. The first replanted mangroves took years to reach the density at which they provide meaningful surge protection. They are still growing. Tacloban was rebuilt. The overseas highway of this story is not a road, but a city reconstructed from its foundations, changed in ways both visible and invisible by what the water did on one morning in November 2013. The airport that was flooded to its roof reopened. The markets came back. The jeepneys moved through the intersections again. New buildings rose on the cleared land near the waterfront, some of them in the no-build zone, despite the regulations, because poverty and land scarcity and the simple human inability to imagine the worst happening twice made the regulations difficult to enforce absolutely. The question that Haiyan forced onto every disaster management system in the typhoon-prone world was not whether the warnings had been issued. They had been issued. It was not whether the evacuations had been ordered. They had been ordered. The question, the one that researchers and emergency managers and government officials are still working through, is whether it is possible to warn people accurately and completely about a catastrophe that exceeds the boundaries of their entire accumulated experience in the hours before it arrives, in a language they can act on. The answer, in 2013, was no. Not reliably, not fast enough. And so the names go on the memorial. 6,300 names. People who heard the warning. People who evacuated. People who did everything the system asked of them and found themselves, in the pre-dawn darkness of November 8th, in buildings the water reached anyway. Super Typhoon Haiyan Yolanda, as the Philippines knew, her remains the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded at landfall in terms of sustained wind speed. She crossed an entire archipelago in 4 hours. She displaced 4 million people. She erased the coastline of a city of 240,000 inches, less time than it takes to watch a film. And she taught the world something it should have already known, that a warning is only as good as the understanding it produces, and that understanding is only as good as the experience that built it, and that when a storm arrives that is larger than every experience that came before it, the gap between the warning and the reality is measured not in words, but in lives. The sky above Tacloban on the morning of November 9th was clear and blue and entirely indifferent. The Pacific was already warm again, and somewhere out over the open ocean, the water was waiting.